It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We have some idea of how a War of the Worlds invasion would go down thanks to many movies. We've even talked about body snatching pod people before and how terrifying it would be for that to spread out from a small town who just needed to go to sleep only to never wake up again. Or at least when they did wake up, they were somebody completely different. Sure, someone who looks like those people, like I said, woke up. They're just not human. But what would happen if an alien race was able to impersonate and then replace people on a military base? Well, I feel like we'd be in pretty bad shape. And that's what this week's Monster Mondays is all about. 1993's Body Snatchers from Warner Brothers was the third time the invasion of the Body Snatchers idea was made into a movie. And while it was only about 15 years after the very well-liked remake by Philip Kaufman starring Donald Sutherland, some people find themselves liking this one quite a bit. In fact, after it played at the Cannes Film Festival, Roger Ebert was one of the critics who praised it and even saying it was superior to the previous adaptations. And it turns out that the idea of body-snatching aliens taking over humanity by localizing the initial invasion in one small area is kind of ripe for constant renewal and revisions as times change. Honestly, we're about due for a fifth version of this idea now, honestly. But one thing that I find kind of interesting that I'm not sure I ever noticed before in the course of the last 30 years, and I was looking at the cover of the Blu-ray that I have of this, and under the title Body Snatchers is the subtitle, The Invasion Continues. It's not really continuing, and that The Invasion Continues was even used in the ad campaign for in the trailer. It's just a new take on the Body Snatchers idea. I wonder if there was something done after the movie was made or after it was edited together and they realized, oh, well, maybe we try to sell this as a sequel to the 1978 version. There is reason to believe that we're not at the very beginning of this invasion, kind of like what we see earlier in the earlier versions, rather. But it's kind of like Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. Dawn is kind of the sequel, right? But it's also kind of not. Either way, I find that subtitle kind of odd. Like, did that lead to confusion that there was a sequel and therefore people didn't go see it? Or were they trying desperately to get more people's eyeballs on it by trying to sell it as a sequel? I don't know. But the appreciation for this film might be mostly due to who made it. Abel Ferrara. Now, Ferrara was kind of a punk rock director. His 1979 horror film, The Driller Killer, was loud, abrasive, and raw. It showed he had a lot of skill as a director, and he even starred in it. 2 years later, his rape revenge film, Ms. 45, would be a visual treat with an amazing lead performance in it. And as the 80s continued, he delved into gritty neo-noir and even worked with Michael Mann on his TV series Miami Vice and Crime Story. The guy had an ability to understand the seedy underbelly of the world and really just slathered his films with a grimy sheen of unpleasantness that could also be kind of quite artistic, in all things considered. But 1993 would be the year that Ferrara would make the only Hollywood studio films of his career. We had Body Snatchers for Warner Brothers and Dangerous Game starring Harvey Keitel, whom he had worked with in Bad Lieutenant the year before, and Madonna for MGM. Later, after making a few more movies in the 90s, he packed up and moved to Europe. And what's interesting is that there are two more names that are exploitation horror superstars, as well as Ferrara, working on this movie. The story is partially credited to Larry Cohen, who did a bunch of great horror stuff in the 70s and 80s, including It's Alive, The Stuff, and Q, the Winged Serpent. A co-writer of the script is none other than Stuart Gordon. Gordon was known for his ooey-gooey work on H.P. Lovecraft adaptations like The Reanimator and From Beyond. But let's talk about Body Snatchers and this inherent terror at the heart of this version of Jack Finney's 1955 novel. The movie opens with a family of 4 on the way to a southern base in Alabama. The family consists of teenaged Marty, played by Gabriel Anwar, her father Steve, who works for the EPA and sent to test effects on the nearby ecosystem. More on that here in just a moment. His second wife, Carol, played by Meg Tilly, and Marty's half-brother, little Andy. They stop at a gas station to fill up, and Marty goes to the bathroom and gets bum-rushed by a guy, and he's relieved to see that she was scared of him. He warns that they get you when you sleep. And she thinks about that, and also Andy says something about that. As the movie continues on, it becomes something that is stuck with her from this very early moment all the way to the end of the movie. They get to the army base and Marty meets Jen, a hard-rockin' chick, and she's the daughter of General Platt. Now, Platt is played by the always great R. Lee Ermey. When Jen takes Marty to her house, they find Mrs. Platt in a deep sleep on the couch, and Jen talks about how her mother is an alcoholic and is always passed out. Now, when they leave the room, we hear something slithering around Mrs. Platt. In another house, a man complains about how his wife and kids treat him like a complete stranger. The wife emotionlessly opens the door and lets in some MPs, and nearby Steve and Carol notice that man is being drug out of his house and arrested by the MPs. The next day, Malone meets with General Platt, who kind of has some disdain for Steve. Basically, the base is a testing ground for eco and biological weapons, and he's there to make sure that there isn't a problem with the surrounding area. And Platt wants Steve to do his testing and then be removed as quickly as possible. He meets then Major Collins, the head of the medical wing of the base, and Collins is played by Forrest Whitaker. And Collins asks Steve if these chemicals can change people's perception of reality. Collins has seen people who are afraid to sleep and exhibiting paranoia about the identities of their friends and families. He wants Steve to basically keep him up to date because he's rather worried for these people. Something is clearly going on. And at the school, all the little kids except for Andy have done the exact same finger painting, revealing that they all are thinking the exact same way. Now, Andy decides that he's going to run away from the quote-unquote bad people, but a young, good-looking chopper pilot named Tim picks him up and takes him back home. And while the trashman collects a single bag of trash from each of the several homes on the street, Tim delivers Andy to Marty. And Andy tells her that all the kids were drawing the same picture and that they tried to make him go to sleep when he didn't want to. Tim then tells Marty that she can find him at the local bar. And when Jen and Marty go out to the bar to meet up with Tim and his buddy Pete, the bar is disturbingly empty and kind of dead, with only a few people in there like usual. A trio of locals are watching silently as well, and that's a little off-putting. When the MPs come to collect the guy who has passed out, Marty recognizes one of the police officers, the guy who scared her at the gas station restroom. This time, he has a completely different demeanor, and he claims that he does not recognize her. And as Marty and Tim get closer, we see soldiers removing pods from a kind of a swamp, or at least it's a very shallow pond. At the Malones, Andy goes into his parents' bedroom to find Carol's head cave in and a freshly nude Carol walk out of the closet. Andy freaks out and says that his mommy is dead, but neither Marty nor Steve believe him. The next morning, the pod person Carol hands a small trash bag to the trash men, revealing that that's the pod people disposing of the deflated and now basically dehydrated human remains of the person they're replacing. When asked if he wants to go back to daycare or if he wants to stay home with mommy, Andy simply tells Steve that his mommy is dead. And Carol just smirks as she stares intently at Steve. As the day continues, more and more indications that people are not normal are seen. Marty goes to see Jen, and Jen knows something is wrong with her mother. She's not drinking alcohol, and she's going with other ladies to play bridge, a game that her mother does not know. At home, Carol is clearly working on converting the rest of the family. She wants Marty to get in the bath where she knows she'll probably end up passing out and taking a nap, only to be replicated by a pod that is positioned above the bathroom. And Carol really wants Andy to get in bed and go to sleep. Also, Steve was near an accident at a storage facility with some of those toxic chemicals that are being used, and it gave him reason to test some of the tissue left behind on one of the workers' suits, because what he saw on the guy's leg looked unlike anything he'd ever seen, and the tests come back quite inconclusive, so he has no idea what was in the barrel, and he doesn't know what was wrong with that guy's leg when it ate through his protective suit. Now, tendrils from the pod in the ceiling over the bathroom start to work on Marty as she naps in the tub, and Carol kind of seductively massages Steve to help relax him so that he falls asleep and another pod can replace him. When Marty wakes up and sees her duplicate that fell into the tub from the ceiling, she freaks out and is basically saved, as well as being able to save both Steve and Andy. When Steve tries to collect Carol so that they can leave, she basically tries to seduce him again by just basically telling him that he'll be all right. He'll forget all of this fear that he has. They'll be together again, but more importantly, there's no place for them to go. What's going on is happening to everyone and everywhere. When he, Marty, and Andy leave the house, she goes to the porch and points them out and screeches, causing most of the families at the base to run after them as they try to get away. Surprisingly, a couple of locals with shotguns help cover the trio's escape, and Tim, getting out of bed and dressing to get into action because of all the commotion going on outside, is confronted by Pete and others from his squad who plan to inject him with something to put him asleep so that he can be replaced too. However, he escapes from them. Now, Steve goes to find Major Collins, who is having a pretty rough night. He's understanding that what people are so afraid of, and he's trying to get an outside line, but he's being told by name that the lines are busy. Major Collins didn't give the operator his name, so they shouldn't know who's calling. Now, Steve tries to convince the Major that they need to leave, but the Major won't go. He wants to fight off the pod people as a last defiant act of his humanity. Steve hides as General Platt and even the Major's wife come in with other pod people soldiers to try to convince the Major to join them. Major Collins decides to shoot himself instead of living a life of conformity. Steve rejoins Marty and Andy and tells them that the pod people can be fooled if they don't show any emotion. But Marty begins to realize that something's not right with her father. In fact, he's been replaced. Tim comes to the rescue and using his gun, Marty shoots Steve. And Steve melts into a bloody pile of goo. And she was right. Somewhere along the way, he was replaced, somewhere in between going to the Major's office and returning to his kids. Tim goes to get a chopper so he, Marty, and Andy can escape the base, but he's surrounded by other pod people, but he pulls the trick of not showing any emotion, and they're convinced that he's been replaced. But however, Marty and Andy are then captured by the pod people and taken to the infirmary so that they can be replaced. He follows them to the infirmary and blends in by remaining emotionless. And he watches as pod people are born all over the place and the human bodies deflate into nothing. Marty is nearly replaced when he gets to her. In fact, her pod person replacement even awakens, and her naked form and the way that she speaks to him is attempting to seduce him. And she begs him not to disconnect her from the original Marty. But by doing so, the pod Marty dies. And as they leave, not showing any emotion, Marty says that she's not going to leave without finding Andy. Jen approaches and attempts to test Marty by saying that she saw Andy somewhere looking for her. But when Marty asks where, Jen reveals herself to have been replaced by a pod person and tips off the others that Marty's not one of them. Tim and Marty run to the chopper to escape and is surprisingly joined by Andy, who has apparently also slipped away from the other pod people. But when he attacks Tim, it's revealed that he too was replaced. Marty tosses Andy out of the chopper and he screeches as he falls to his death. General Platt lets them go, knowing that no one's going to believe them. And the next day, Tim starts destroying trucks headed to various other locations and bases to begin the conversion of others. And Marty's narration reveals her intense hatred of the pod people, indicating that perhaps this ordeal has already removed her own humanity and replaced it with hate as she watches the base they escaped from being destroyed and burned to the ground. Now let's talk about 3 things that I like about 1993's Body Snatchers. First, this is one hell of a fast-moving movie. I think it's well structured by not lingering too long on the setup. I have to assume some people who saw this movie in 1993 either just vaguely know the story or might not have seen the other 2 versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but the concept doesn't really need a whole lot of setup. People in a town or city start to act differently. And in those earlier versions, it's a slow-moving invasion. Here, the invasion has basically already happened. Sure, the other 2 versions had brief glimpses of something already kicking off by the time we've joined the story, but it's still pretty early in this process. Here, we know that's not exactly the same case. There's been enough time for the guy in the bathroom who bum rushed Marty to know that people have changed and they get you when you sleep. And that has to mean that the invasion has started at least a week ago to notice these 2 facts, and maybe even longer. It's kind of slow where the base is still not completely overrun by pod people, but we're coming into the story and the Malones have arrived about halfway through the invasion. Some people have been replaced, and those people are growing the other pods so that they can replace other people. And then it starts to really kick into high gear as far as the invasion goes. But the invasion has already taken hold and taken root, not to be too cheeky with the pun there as far as these pod people are concerned. But the movie is indeed fast-paced, and we're seeing this also from an outsider's perspective as Marty, our lead, is new to this base and has no basis over what is different about the place or what's right about it and what's wrong. So we're just getting this cold feeling from people as we think, oh, well, she's the new person. She's already been othered by being a new person. But then that only leads us to find out that they're not people at all. And I like that a lot. And we're kind of coming into this already kind of on edge, because if we're viewing this through our lead character, Marty, we're already outsiders. Second, the performances are very strong in this movie. In particular, we have Gabrielle Anwar, who has always been appealing. She's great as a leading character. She's sweet and a little disaffected, but not greatly annoying or overly combative. We understand that, her mother has died and her father has moved on and there's a new mom in her life. And while she doesn't overly show a great deal of appreciation or even a great deal of satisfaction in the situation, she's kind of, she's at least protective of her half brother, and she's trying to make the best of the scenario. She's not just easy on the eyes, but she's easy to like and follow. Forrest Whitaker is this chain-smoking medic at the base who is worried about all the soldiers to the point of being downright nervous and shaken. His delivery is so obviously disturbed, but he has no idea what to do and is pitch perfect. when we see him later, when he is absolutely insane, he does know what to do, which is a nice little turn of events there as well. But when we first meet him and he's talking to Steve about what these toxins could possibly do to somebody's psyche, you can tell he's already nervous. But Meg Tilly, though, is really the best in this movie. Sure, she's the stepmom and Marty's not too sure about her, but when she's replaced by a pod person, for a good chunk of this movie, she is this film's villain and comes across pretty terrifying. She has this look about her. She almost becomes seductive just by standing there. Obviously, the first time we see her, she's fully nude, but that's not what makes her seductive. She has, and this is why you get a solid actress like Meg Tilly to do this. She talks a certain way. She tries to lull you to sleep. I mean, it's almost hypnotic in a way, but she is a force in this movie, and she has this wonderful piece of dialogue. And it's like the aforementioned Dawn of the Dead that leaves what will become of the planet quite ambiguous as far as where the story goes from here. The line is, where are you going to go? Where are you going to run? Where are you going to hide? Nowhere, because there's no one like you left. That's such a killer line, and she delivers it so menacingly. It almost betrays the idea that the pod people don't show emotion. It's not that they don't show emotion. They are fighting for their own survival. And that piece of dialogue elicits so much fear in Steve that she then tries to use that to her benefit to seduce him into letting that fear go so that they can be together as pod people. I mean, and it's a killer line, and obviously everyone knew it because it was used again for the final moment of the movie and slowed down to be even more scary. And it's something that you get the impression is rattling around inside of Marty's head for basically the rest of her human life. But third, let's talk about that ambiguous ending. In the first two versions, it's relatively clear that the invasion was small and targeted. In the first version, it was an invasion in a small town where the rest of the world would not take a whole lot of notice until it spread and it was too late. In the second version, it was an invasion in a huge metropolitan city, in a place with that many people. Changes would not be noticed until it spreads enough to be far too late. In this version, the lines that Meg Tilly speaks about where Steve and then later Marty could possibly go because no one like them are left indicates that this was a widespread invasion, or the invasion had already surpassed the point of it being too late for humanity. I love how much you think about whether the takeover of the base was enough to be able to spread so quickly that there isn't enough to stop the invasion, or was this one of many places across the entirety of the planet that was infested with the pods that replace people? On the surface, the invasion taking over a base with what's available to the pod people at that point is already pretty scary. Yet, what if all military bases were the first place to start? That seems pants-crappingly terrifying. Even if it was just some of the bases and then a handful of small towns, that's already enough to basically win the invasion before anyone knew it was really happening. It's a smart way to play this version to keep it unique from the other two. It's already a really good movie, but then, you're kind of left pondering things well beyond the conclusion as well. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we have ourselves an invitation from Vincent Price and John Carradine to the Monster Club. So until next week, stay spooky.